to try to address the legitimation crisis that they face by using our energy, in essence, against ourselves. And what do I mean by that? That basically the state using the so-called insurrection at the Capitol and the emergence of this traditional right-wing movement represented by the Trump forces, that the state is using that momentum, that reality, that political reality, in a way to, in fact, do the opposite of what we thought might happen with a Biden victory. And that is to, in fact, create the political space that would allow us to be able to organize and to advance our forces. In fact, what we're seeing from the state is a move to constrain and to constrict political analysis, alternative information, to impose on us an ideological conformity that in fact supports and sustains the neoliberal project. So our desire to jettison this more traditional and stereotypical kind of fascist represented by the authoritarianism and cartoonish character of Donald Trump may be setting us up to not recognize even more insidious and perhaps dangerous move being made by the state to usher in a form of neo-fascism that we inadvertently can support or will support by having our attention diverted away from that threat. And what I mean by that is this, that basically when we recognize and remember that neoliberalism is a form of fascism. Neoliberalism, and our dear professor is going to talk about this more in a moment. But, you know, neoliberalism came in on the back of a fascist move in Chile. It is a rightist tendency. It is the terroristic coordination of society on behalf of big capital. It is a system that combines and converges capital, big capital, and the state. And as a consequence of that, it is threatened by any kind of upsurge from the people. So what we have to be very careful of is not recognizing that as a consequence of this capitalist crisis, and we have to understand that you can't understand neoliberalism and neo-fascism abstracted from capitalism. There's a consequence of this capitalist crisis that the state is moving to address its legitimation crisis by strengthening the national security state. So this space that we thought we might have, I think is under threat. And therefore we have to be absolutely clear about how we move, absolutely clear about our relationship to the state, our understanding of the state, our understanding of the social and class forces that are supporting the neoliberal Democrats. Because what we can find ourselves inadvertently doing is in fact giving political cover to this move by neoliberal fascism at this critical moment. So, you know, the analysis is something we have to continue to grapple with. We have to talk about the kinds and forms of organizations that we have to begin to build to address this critical moment, because the objective reality is this: the contradictions of this colonial capitalist order will continue to deepen. The redundancy that African people, the African working class and other people of color, the other colonized people in this country face will continue to deepen. The fiscal crisis that this state is facing will result in severe suffering on the part of millions of people here in this country and globally. So we have to be prepared for this kind of struggle that we have to engage in. And we have to continue these kinds of conversations to talk about the kinds of organized resistance we have to engage in. And we have to remind ourselves too, and I close here with this comment, that the key, beyond organization, of course, the key is effectively engaging in the struggle over ideas, to understand that the terrain of consciousness is a contested terrain, and that we've got to understand the challenges of the ideological struggle that we are involved in, because the state understands that, and they are putting into place mechanisms to ensure that the only acceptable views and ideals that will be allowed to be disseminated are those ideals that uphold the capitalist state and the settler colonial project.
You could talk a little bit about how you see the connection between wars waged on Black communities within the US via policing is one way, but the wars that get waged on Black communities within the US to, wars that the US wages abroad. Just what is the connection there? How are we understanding the function of these two things in relation to one another?
Thank you. I think that what we've been talking about this evening are those connections. What we're talking about is the structural manifestation, the political expression of the white supremacist, colonial, capitalist patriarchy that developed once Europe spilled out of its boundaries in 1492 and invaded the Americas, creating the material basis for its eventual global hegemony. What we are seeing today, as Joe Biden talks about the need for unity and reestablishing relationships between the US and Europe, is his attempt to rehabilitate or revive, if you will, some of the relationships that were not severed, but under pressure as the Trump forces advanced their America First project that exposed the tensions and contradictions between the US-based capitalists and the global, the transnational finance and corporate capital. That project that Joe Biden is attempting to revive is a project of white supremacy. It is a project that says that the only way that the Pan-European project will survive is if we find a way to work together again, to re-embrace the concept that Kwame Nkrumah talked about, collective imperialism under the leadership of the US. That's why they say that Joe Biden is a transatlanticist. But we have to unpack that and expose it. We have to see, we have to identify for what it is. It is a white supremacist project. And that's why this notion of white supremacy is so fundamentally important. And I'm not talking about the cartoonish understanding of white supremacy that the clownish activities of some of these militias, as dangerous as they might be, that correspond to our sort of simplistic understanding of what a racist is supposed to be. I'm talking about the more sophisticated white supremacy, the white supremacist ideology that sees Europe as the apex of civilization, that sees European culture as the most developed culture of the globe, and that sees something that we refer to as modernization, as the inevitable ending point of all people, and that all nations and all people should strive to mimic and try to be like Europe. Okay, those notions of white supremacy, that white supremacist ideology is something that is not reducible to race or ethnicity gender, or anything else. Okay, that's why we say that Barack Obama is a white supremacist. That's why we say that the Democratic Party is a white supremacist party. So the attempt by Joe Biden is to rehabilitate that project. And at the center of that project, this is what we have to remind ourselves. The center of this white supremacist colonial capitalist project, the mechanism by which it enforces itself and maintains its hegemony is state violence. The embracing of this white supremacist structure called NATO, the enhancement of the US ability to wage war with these obscene military budgets, the creation of the Department of Defense 1033 program domestically, that is the program responsible for militarizing police forces across this country, the Israeli training of police forces. All of these are the structural expressions of this commitment to maintaining white supremacy through force. We've got to understand that and recognize that. Understand that war is being waged against us in this country and globally, not just against African people, but against all colonized people. When we understand the terms of struggle, and then the strategies become more clear. So we in the Black Alliance of Peace, we try to be clear. You know, we say basically, you know, when we came together and launched this thing in 2017, we understood the trajectory of US politics. We understood that the crisis of legitimacy was only going to continue to deepen. And we knew that as a consequence of that, the state would be more dependent on the use of force and violence. And we had to prepare our people for that. So this move by Joe Biden is a move to reestablish white supremacy, but in a more acceptable form. We've got to unpack it. We've had to expose it. Look, both parties are committed to the idea of full spectrum dominance. At the center of full spectrum dominance is militarism. Okay, so the war being waged against African people and colonized people in this country, in the US domestically, is part of the global process of attempting to try to maintain a global white supremacist imperialism. And that is the connection that we have to continually make. Most people don't even know, for example, how the US has divided up the entire planet into these global command structures, the arrogance of these people. And one of the main command structures that we've been attempting to highlight in the Black Alliance of Peace's work is the US Africa Command, a command that was created October 1st, 2008, right before the ascendancy of your first Black president, and expanded under that person 2,400%. The footprint on the African continent is massive. 53 out of the 54 states on the African continent have military relations in military to military relation with the US. The US is training police forces across the African continent. And these are some of the same kinds of comprador and neoliberal puppets that are fronting for white power on the continent that we have in the US. The same kind of neoliberal comprador puppets fronting for white power across the country in all of these Democrat-controlled cities. Okay, so we make those connections politically, and we make those connections in terms of the role of the state. So these are the things we have to make, and we have to articulate these things in clear, unambiguous language. And that's why I'm so happy about this conversation tonight, because folks are laying it out in clear terms. And this is exactly what we have to do. We look, time out for any kind of vagueness. You know, our people will understand what we're up against. They'll understand what capitalism is. They will understand what is imperialism. They'll understand what is colonialism. But we've got to be prepared with the language and the vocabulary and the skills to engage our folks, okay? But that is the historic responsibility right now, folks. You know, if we're not talking about building a revolutionary response, a revolutionary movement here in this country, that basically we just propping up, upholding white supremacy. That's the connection.
Someone wrote, how and to what extent are the political structures and mechanisms of government on this land actually dependent on imperialist domination and extraction globally? Where could we learn more about this relationship? And the second part of the question is, does dismantling of US empire mean dismantling of the US? And where could we learn about this further? So if one of the panelists wants to maybe just clarify and respond to that question.
I would jump in real quick and say that basically not only the relationship between the U.S. and the world resulted in, or the relationship between the U.S., the settler colonial state, and the expansion of its power across the territory that came to be known as the U.S. Provided the material basis for what we see as the U.S. state. That relationship was then enhanced as the U.S. state expanded beyond the borders of its conquered territories and was in competition with the other European empires globally. And that competition, of course, ended up being centered on places like, for example, Africa. That led to the Berlin Conference, where they tried to mediate and mitigate the tensions between them. It eventually led to the first imperialist war, and then eventually the second imperialist war. So violence is at the center of this project. Super exploitation is at the center of it. And that's why this conversation is so incredibly important, because people are laying out and making the connections between the material basis of U.S. policies. That is not just about some bad people in Congress that maybe we can change their minds, but it's about an understanding that these folks have objective interests and that they are attempting to make policy to advance their interests. Biden wants to maintain the hegemony of U.S. capital. He wants to be able to make U.S. capital more effective. He wants to reposition U.S. capitalists to be able to more effectively exploit the land, resources, and labor of people globally. The creation of the West is as a consequence of colonial exploitation. So yes, those connections we make, and when we begin to shift power from this rapacious class, this greedy, rapacious class, the rapacious greed of these freaks, it will end up being the dismantlement of the U.S. colonial state, and in fact, the West. You can't have it both ways. There's no way that we're going to be able to, we're not going to reform this, especially when we talk about and understand this basis, that basically we're not prepared for authentic decolonization, which means completely revamping this state, taking power away from these corporate capitalists and bringing that power to the people. Then you're not really prepared for liberation, because that's the only way that we're able to free ourselves and, in fact, free the world.
Okay.
Well, just real quick, a concrete example of how white supremacy is normalized. The very fact that people in the U.S. can support the notion that the U.S. state has a right and a responsibility to determine the leadership of other nations like Venezuela is, to me, a concrete manifestation of that ideology. You know, the same argument that they made concerned about Russian interference and all of that, you know, they don't understand that basically, you know, there's a connection between that and their so-called concern about, and their attempt to assert themselves on nations like Venezuela. And the logic that one can use that they asserted around Donald Trump could have been used again when Donald Trump contested the election. And if another country like the Russians or whoever decided that they were going to recognize Donald Trump as the legitimate president, then the rationale was consistent. It's the same thing that they have done in Venezuela and other places. But the fact that these things are not connected and that people don't seem to even recognize it, to me, is a concrete manifestation of the assumptions of white privilege and white supremacy.
Folks, to just speak on, what do you see as some winning strategies for weakening US empire and for growing our movement to resist? And if folks want to speak on just any ways that folks can be taking action in this moment.
Well, I see in the chat some people are saying join an organization, and I think that is in fact key. I'm so grateful to Dissenters for pulling this panel together and for the work that they have embraced. It's so incredibly important to see folks who understand the absolute necessity for us to bring back into the center of discourse the issue of imperialism, and to encourage people to embrace an anti-imperialist position. It is a major contradiction in this country for people to be able to identify themselves as so-called radicals, but yet never say a mumbling word about US imperialism. So that's one thing that we have to do, that we have a responsibility, I believe, being at the center of empire, to in fact be in solidarity with the struggling people around the globe. Understanding that in that kind of solidarity, it only strengthens all of us, that we're not going to be able to address the contradictions we're facing in the US while understanding that we're part of one global system, and that we've got to be in solidarity with all people who are struggling against our common enemy. And we share a common vision in terms of where we need to go as collective humanity. So we say in the Black is Back Coalition and the Black Alliance for Peace that we must turn imperialist wars into wars against imperialism. And the only way we do that, my friends, is by organizing ourselves and doing the deep base building work that we've been suggesting and implying here this evening. So support and join Dissenters. Support and join the Black Alliance for Peace. Get into organizations. Take up the task of engaging our people in political dialogue. Communicate the responsibility that we all have to be organized, but also help everyone to understand that organized, conscious, it may be a cliche, but the people are undefeated. And that sense of inspiration, that sense of our task is something we've got to talk about. We've got to center that and tell people that the degradation and dehumanization that we are subjected to in this backward and barbaric system, it can't be altered, it can't be eliminated. That there is, in fact, a difference, that we can transcend this. So let's inspire each other, support each other, and let's communicate to the people that, in fact, we can win.